Okay, welcome everybody. So my name is Dan Gorman. I know I think most of you in the list of attendees here so far. But for those I don't, I am a historian and a faculty member here at the Balsley School. And I'm very excited today to have two of my colleagues who have helped to produce, my co-editor and then the editor of, or the author of one of our wonderful chapters of our new book on the historical origins of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So maybe first I'll just introduce our two guests, and then I'll say a few words about the book and the project itself. And then I will turn it over to our two guests. They'll speak a little bit about their contributions to the book. I'll speak after that, just for a few moments on the chapter that I did as well. And then we'll open it up to some questions and answers, or to a Q&A session. So first of all, to introduce our guests, I'm very happy to first introduce the co-editor of the volume, and indeed the inspiration, the founding editor, if you will, of the book itself. It was his idea to launch this. Dr. Martin Gutmann, who is coming to us virtually today from the Lucerne School of Business. Dr. Gutmann is also a senior lecturer in the Department of Management, Technology, and Economics at ETH Zurich. Written on a wide variety of topics, including the history of Germany in the Second World War, many topics in terms of environmental history, and other projects that feed directly into the SDGs themselves. And then our second guest, I'm very happy to introduce to our Balsley community, Dr. Jessica Fanzo, who is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Global Food Policy and Ethics at the Berman Institute of Bioethics, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and the Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Fanzo has far too many publications for me to even give you a little taster of, but pun intended. I will point attention to her recent 2021 book, Can Fixing Dinner Fix the Planet? And Dr. Fanzo will talk a little later this morning on the chapter that she's done on SDG 2 on hunger. So I'll share my screen now, and I just want to talk a little bit about the book itself. Again, to share some of the goals that we had and to set up our discussion this morning. So before the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the historical companion. So the title gives us the goal, the purpose of the volume itself. As no doubt all of you know, in 2015, the UN, after prolonged and quite extensive sort of negotiations, discussions, and so forth, with stakeholders all around the world, produced the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. They come on the heels of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and lots of other sort of UN-led global governance policy initiatives over the past few decades. But what we were interested in doing is putting the SDGs into historical context. So where did they come from as goals? There are 169, I believe, targets in the SDGs themselves. They all have policy histories, but we were also interested in thinking about and writing about collectively, all of the authors that have participated and contributed to the volume, in writing histories of the various issue areas, the interconnected issue areas that the SDGs speak to. So in other words, how did we come as a global community to these 17 SDGs as policy prescriptions, targets, benchmarks, goals, and so forth, but also how have these various issue areas been defined as questions for global governance? So that is what the book is about. We have a wonderful cover. I just want to keep the cover up there for a little while. And I will point to something that is a bit of an aside, but I find interesting in terms of what is, after all, a very public-facing and UN-driven initiative. when we initially wanted to have the actual icons of the SDGs themselves, we were told, no, we can't use those. So what the press has done, and probably none of you even notice this unless you look really carefully, is actually to very slightly modify all of these. So they're either in a different color than they are in the actual icons themselves on the UN page, or they have very minor shifts. So for instance, the top, the 6 people in the icon on the top there, they're just rearranged from the icon that the actual SDGs use. That's neither here nor there, but I thought that was an interesting aside. So in terms of the book itself and what the SDGs are, again, many of you will be familiar with them, but here are the actual icons and, more importantly, the 17 goals. So stretching from poverty and zero hunger through questions of global social governance in terms of quality education, gender equality, economic issues in terms of decent work, economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure, and so forth. And Dr. Gutmann will speak a little bit about that. And then, of course, questions of environmental sustainability. So whether that's climate action, water, and so forth. And then the final goal, which I'll speak about a little later, briefly this morning or early this afternoon, is what I call the operative SDGs. So SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. So it is the one SDG that really speaks to all of the other 16. All 17 are, of course, interconnected. But SDG 17, in terms of partnership, speaks to some of the ways that the goals propose, aspire to seeing the goals actually being delivered through international cooperative networks. So in terms of the volume, and I won't go through all of this, but just to give you a little sense of the contents of the book itself. First of all, the image on the left of the screen, I think more so than even the oft reproduced UN image from the previous slide, really gives us a sense of the impetus behind the SDGs themselves and how they emerge both as interconnected sets of policy goals, but also means to address interconnected global issues. So these are not designed as 17 goals, as most of you will know, that are freestanding and independent. They were conceived intentionally and perceived intentionally as interconnected goals. And I think we can see that in a lot of the different chapters that our contributors and our colleagues have written. So the book is organized around each of the 17 SDGs, and Martin spearheaded an absolutely remarkable, I think, recruitment drive to recruit. I think we're over 30, I can't remember the actual number, but we're over 30 contributors. A number of the chapters, as you can see on the slide here, have multiple contributors. And what I think is really remarkable, I would say this, of course, but what I think is really remarkable about the volume is that we have contributors from many different disciplines. So just as we do here at the Balsillie School, one of the goals of the volume was to think historically about the SDGs from both multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives. So some of us are historians, others of us are economists, sociologists, political scientists, and so forth and so on. So not only do we have a united sort of historical sort of interrogation of the SDGs and the various issue areas that they speak to, but we've also drawn together historical insights from a number of different disciplinary perspectives. So we all in our various disciplines think historically in different ways, sometimes consciously, maybe sometimes more unconsciously. But one of the things that, at least speaking personally, and I think Martin would agree, that I found really interesting is editing and reading works, historically informed works from colleagues from other disciplines and learning how people think historically as an economist or as a sociologist and so forth. And certainly in writing my own contributions, and I think sort of engaging with the quite fruitful conversations with all of our contributors through the editing process, it was, I think, mutually instructive, to collectively think how we can think historically and what legacies we can draw from that history, how we can contextualize the SDGs in the here and now. Perhaps, and this isn't always the case, history doesn't always do this for us, but perhaps at least for some of the SDGs or for some of our authors, how the various histories that they wrote and wrote about can inform going forward how these various SDGs will be met and taken on by people all over the world. So here again, you can just see the remaining chapters. And what I would maybe highlight here, I think I have some students that I've taught in the past here, and I've done this in the class, so apologies. But what I would point to is some of the verbs in the chapter titles. So caretaking, on the previous slide here, I think we've got unfolding and so forth and so on. So if I go back to kind of my grade school grammar, I sometimes like to think about writing history in terms of interrogating those active verbs in the past tense. So how have things developed over time, and so forth and so on. And all of our chapters from, again, different disciplinary perspectives get at that question. How and why did many of the issue areas that the SDGs speak to, how did they emerge as global issues or problems? Something like climate change, for instance, as something going on in the ecosphere has been going on for a long time. But it's only from the 1970s forward, at least in a concerted and, again, pardon the pun, sustained fashion, that we have seen global cooperative efforts to confront climate change. So that's an interesting historical question in and of itself. How and why have certain historical or certain global issues been defined as global over time? And what implications has that had for the creation of, again, international cooperative initiatives to speak to all of these issue areas? And finally, before I turn it over to Dr. Gutmann, the SDGs, I think, are really remarkable, amongst other things, because what they present is a benchmark of benchmarks. So again, you can go through, some of you will be very familiar with many of the individual SDGs, of course, but you can go through and see the various targets and goals and benchmarks and really ways to measure, not just to identify, but to measure progress and problem-solving efforts to address all of these issue areas. And we can see this actually unfolding in the only few years now since the SDGs have been released into the wild, if you will. So even here at the University of Waterloo, and I know there are similar initiatives at institutions, educational and otherwise, all around the world now, the SDGs have been taken up explicitly as one of our, so the MAG for our guests is the Masters of Arts in Global Governance that we offer here. But Matt Thiessen, who is currently the Director of Sustainability at the University of Waterloo and an alumni of one of our master's programs, as he puts it, the SDGs are a holistic framework. And the University of Waterloo has taken them as such and applied them to the many things that we do on campus and used some of the goals and targets and benchmarks as ways to measure the university community's progress in addressing many of the issue areas that the SDGs speak to. So I'll leave it there. That's sort of an introduction to the project itself and the book. A little later, I'll speak about SDG 17. But now I'll turn it over to Dr. Gutmann, who can speak about his contributions to the book itself.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Dan, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm joining you on a lovely summer evening here in Freiburg im Breisgau, which is a city in southern Germany, just across the border from Switzerland, where I work and am originally from. And it was really a great pleasure. I can only agree with what Dan already said, to work on this book with so many authors from all over the world, from different disciplines. And as I was thinking about what to talk about today, there were many things that came to mind, not just in terms of the content of the book, but also the process of putting it together. But I am aware that appearing on Zoom as opposed to in person, there's always the danger if I run over my time that I will be muted or uninvited. So I decided to stay very narrow in my talk so that I could stay within the given time frame. And in fact, what I've done is I only have 2 slides, and I hope to make just one point with those 2 slides. And to give you just a brief context before I begin, my origin story, Dan already hinted at this, but in my case, it's a bit more specific. In my previous role as a faculty member at ETH Zurich, where I am in fact still a lecturer, but this was a full-time role, I directed a program for aspiring public sector leaders from around the world with an emphasis on the SDGs. And I was impressed year after year with the commitment among these young governance professionals from Ghana, from Guatemala, from all over Asia and Europe and elsewhere to work on the SDGs. And they were very fluent in all the different aspects, the financial aspects, the economic aspects of the SDGs. However, what I noticed as a historian was that many of them and many of my colleagues among the faculty approached these issues as if they had only come about in 2015, which of course, as Dan said, is not the case. So my original goal was simply to create a collection of works which those professionals or students or managers today working on the SDGs can go to read what the authors of each chapter considers to be the relevant history behind that SDG. And I'm just going to quickly go to my screen here. There we go. In visualizing and in teaching history, I think there's no more basic tool than the timeline, which all of us are familiar with from grade school beyond. And the beauty of a timeline is that it communicates the passing of time, progress, but also zeroes in on specific milestones in the human story. And if your history schooling looks anything like mine did from middle school through college, you probably spent a lot of time learning about these very dates: the fall of Constantinople, the Treaty of Westphalia, the Declaration of Independence in the US, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the First World War, the ending of the Second World War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and 2 years later, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think especially for School of International Affairs, these dates are probably very present. And I would say also looking around today, of course, with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, these dates carry a lot of explanatory power. But if we look to other pressing areas of concern today, I think these dates, these traditional historical dates that we focus on when we look back, are of limited relevance. Just last month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change announced in very stark terms that we are at a critical juncture and that without immediate action, we will not be able to avoid a climate disaster. As I was preparing this talk this morning, and before you think this is very last minute, my morning started 12 hours ago because it's evening for me. So as I was preparing this morning and drinking my coffee, I read that the World Meteorological Organization estimates that there's a 50-50 chance that we will surpass the critical threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming in the next 5 years. So these are, other concerns that I think are as pressing as the very tragic war just east of where I'm sitting and other very important issues that are going on as well. And history to me is a foundational discipline. It should provide the necessary background and a framing to other disciplines and professions that seek to tackle today's problems, whatever those might be. And so I think for those who are concerned with sustainable development, of which the climate crisis is just one of 3 domains, of course, those who work to create solutions on the SDGs, the history that they need to make sense of where we are today cannot be surmised from this traditional timeline. And so my aim today in this brief talk is essentially the same as with the book itself, to package historical research in a way that's relevant to professional students, managers, fellow scholars who are interested in sustainable development and the challenges that they seek to address. And one very simple way to do that, I think, is just to present an alternative timeline to the one that I was taught, to the one that we see here on this slide. And the timeline that I will propose is, of course, not all-encompassing, it's not comprehensive, nor is it definitive in any way. Instead, what I did was simply go through the two chapters that I co-wrote, one with Tayo Adesina from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria on SDG 9, and the other with Christine Fürst, also of Germany, from the University of Halle on SDG 15. And I asked myself, what 6 dates did we keep referencing in the narratives that we constructed in those chapters? Put differently, what 6 dates would I foreground in the story of industry and production on one hand, and in land use on the other hand? And this is what I came up with. So I'll take you through these dates quickly. 10,000 BCE is in fact a date that I learned about in school a long time ago. And I learned about it as the start of the celebrated Neolithic or agricultural revolution, when humans, supposedly, this is what I was taught, invented agriculture. This is not quite true, because the intentional cultivation of ecosystems for food production had existed for thousands of years earlier. And often this took the form of sustainable closed-loop agriculture, relying on a diversity of complementary species. Instead, I think the significance of this agricultural revolution was the advent of food production on dedicated, often monocultural plots of annual or semi-annual crops, wheat, barley, rice, etc. And though this type of farming, of course, enabled us to produce enormous yields in Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Yellow River in China, and elsewhere up to this day, it also came with enormous environmental costs. And at the same time, it began to obscure, as it spread, the many other forms of cultivating ecosystems that had existed before. Now, moving on to our next date here, making quite a leap, 1721, the year in which the brothers Loam opened a water-powered silk throwing mill on the outskirts of Derby in England. This was one of the first commercially viable factories and an early instance of the transition to industrial production. This transition, both globally and in England, was very gradual and very uneven. Just 3 decades later, there were just 7 silk throwing mills in England, and a majority of Britons worked in agriculture, not industry, until at least 1850. But it's the slow and the very much cumulative change that is so profound and so astounding. I'm of the school of historians that finds that the term industrial revolution is inadequate, that it was just as much, or perhaps even more, a revolution in the intensity of commercial activity and an energy revolution. It's easy to forget, but before this period, before the Industrial Revolution, annual per capita economic growth was essentially 0. Since the 1800s, growth has remained fixed at around 1%, rising at times, such as in the post-World War II period, to 3%. Similarly, before the Industrial Revolution, human muscle accounted for over 70% of all mechanical energy, and annual per capita energy use remained more or less static. But of course, by tapping into stored energy in the forms of fossil fuels, converting it into kinetic and thermal energy through technologies such as the steam and the diesel engine, humans were able to break free from this old energy regime. And I probably don't need to tell you that world energy use shot up. One measure, for example, measured in millions of metric tons of oil equivalent, shot up from 250 in 1800 to 10,000 in 2000. I think in the context of international affairs, which many of you are working in, one of the most significant developments in the 20th century was the rise of the Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States as global powers. But a parallel development to this, indeed a prerequisite, I would say, was the intensification of agricultural production on each of these continents' steppes, or prairie, as it is referred to in the US and Canada. And many things facilitated this, but a critical component was the tractor, one of the earliest versions of which was invented in 1892. And this set in motion a development that has continued to this day. The Dust Bowl in the interwar years, I think, was just one blip in this. Today, it's estimated that 99% of the original prairie humus in what's now the United States and Canada has been lost to plowing. The Ogallala Aquifer, which is vital not just to agriculture, but to life in the American Midwest, is rapidly depleting. It's been depleted by half since 1960. And if it is entirely emptied, it would take some 6,000 years, according to one estimate, to refill naturally. In Soviet Union, we see a similar transformation. The Aral Sea there is just one example of the consequences. In 1900, it was the fourth largest inland sea, and it has in the world, and has now, by the early 2000s, shrunk by 75% of its volume. Moving on to our next date that was frequently cited in these two chapters, 1911. It's easy to forget today how disruptive factory work was to those who were new to it. It was loud, it was very hot, very repetitive, and linked to a measure of time much more precise than humans had been exposed to before. One contemporary manager in the early years of the Industrial Revolution wrote that his work involved, quote, training human beings to identify themselves with the unvarying regularity of complex automation. I think this is a perspective that carries across time to the Foxconn factories in China, and perhaps might also be behind the Great Resignation that we're reading about so much today. In 1911, this fervor behind what was called scientific management took concrete form with the publication of Frederick Taylor's The Principles of Scientific Management. And his focus was really on enabling managers to break down the artisanal style of production in which each producer or worker leveraged his or her years of experience in producing a particular good in a unique way, and instead standardizing parts and standardizing human motions. Another profound development in the last 200 years is the transformation of tropical forest to grass and farmland. This is a process that began with the plantation economies set up in European colonies, but has accelerated since then. And the point I want to make here is that this is not just a story of deforestation. It's also a story of homogenization of what sustainability and conservation should look like. So pre-colonization, large parts of African and South American forests had been very actively managed for food and other resources. Yet when Europeans first ventured into these areas, such as the Spaniards in South America, one of our co-contributors, Jeremy Cardona, has pointed out in a book, all they could see was jungle, which they cleared to make room for monocultural plantations. But, and this is the vital point, at the same time as forest was cut down to create room for plantations, many European colonial authorities forcibly cut the local population off from the remaining forested areas in the name of conservation. And in large parts of Africa, even to this day, to some extent, we have an absurd scenario in which big game hunting and safari drives, usually by wealthy whites, was and is seen as compatible with conservation, but agroforestry practices that had been cultivated over generations by the local population were not. And one date that symbolizes this process quite well, I think, is the creation of Kruger National Park in South Africa in 1926. And the final date that I have on my alternative timeline here is 2022, not so long ago. I think today we're all aware, including where I'm sitting right now, that we interact with an almost exclusively human-built environment. The houses we live in, the pavement we walk on, the clothes we wear, even a lot of seemingly natural artifacts, the food we eat, the city parks we spend our free time in, are to some extent the product of deliberate human design. And one milestone in this development is the year 2020, the year in which the combined weight of all human-produced material for the first time surpassed that of biomass. Now, the dates that I presented here, I think, are somewhat arbitrary. And this speaks to the fact that I believe we need to rethink history, how we speak about it, how we teach it, how we use it to further our understanding of contemporary issues. Because dates that relate to political and international issues are much more accommodating to timelines. Regime change, wars, treaties, etc., all started and ended on very specific dates. But most of the developments related to environmental and social history, very much to our current predicament and the Sustainable Development Goals, are much more gradual, more muddled in their evolution, but they're absolutely profound in their cumulative nature. And we need to look below these individual dates to see the important trends that can inform how we got to the place we are today, and what options we might have for the future. And I will conclude my talk here simply by saying that looking back on history, I think perched as we are on the precipice of ecological and potentially social disaster, I believe that not the specific timeline that I presented, but one like it that foregrounds these subtle but very much profound changes in how we've related to our environment over time and to production of our goods and food is more helpful and more relevant starting point than one that focuses exclusively on dates of political or geographic significance. Thank you very much for listening. I'll hand it back over to Dan or directly to Jess.
Thanks, Martin. So yes, I'll turn it over to Dr. Fanzo now, who will speak on her contribution.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to share the Zoom with both Martin and Dan, and it was really great to be able to contribute to this important book. I am not a historian. I'm a nutritionist by training, and the chapter that I had worked on was in very close collaboration, and the lead author, Derek Byerly, who a lot of you know, an economist, has worked for a long time on food security issues for the World Bank and other entities. So I'll be presenting on behalf of both of us. So let me share my screen. Okay, great. So our chapter is really all about trying to understand the history of how ending hunger was addressed globally. And it's a long and sordid story of interesting ebbs and flows of political action and then at times complete deafening quiet inaction. And the way we've looked at hunger has really evolved. Historically, hunger was always thought to be a form of death from starvation, but the whole definition and our concept of hunger has really changed to be something much broader, which includes different forms of malnutrition like stunting and wasting, which I'll talk about in a bit. But even more, hunger has been couched under what we call malnutrition, and that includes the opposite of hunger, and that is overweight and obesity and diet-related non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and stroke, and all of the health costs that manifest from malnutrition, largely due to unhealthy diets, insufficient diets. So there's been a real evolution over the last 100 years of what does actually hunger mean, and what are the manifestations of hunger. And while this evolution was happening, there was a real burgeoning of a new science called nutrition that really emerged during the 20th century with the discovery of many key nutrients, essential micronutrients, vitamins and minerals that are very important for human health. And over time, there's been a consensus around a social ethic. And that social ethic is that there are sound economic, social, and political reasons for tackling the hunger problem at a global scale. And the overwhelming rationale to do so, to tackle that, is ethical, that everyone has the right to adequate food, everyone has the right to sufficient and healthy diets, and better human health. So as I talk about some of the historical landmark stages of how we've thought about hunger, it's really come to the forefront as it being one that you have a moral pull to address hunger, and no one should go to bed hungry. This all began to emerge really in the second half of the 19th century, and by the middle 20th century, when it was enshrined into international commitments, notably the first UN declaration on the goal of zero hunger in 1943. And periodically, reducing hunger, ending hunger has been renewed in international fora, and most recently in the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly SDG 2. Again, this terminology of ending hunger or zero hunger. And even most recently with the UN Food System Summit that just happened late last year, you'd hear this language around ending or zeroing hunger. So noble indeed to try to end hunger, but really when we look back historically and what has been achieved, there's been mixed success in eliminating hunger, and even less so for combating all the other forms of malnutrition. When we look at where we are in addressing malnutrition, sorry, this number is outdated. This is 811 million people are undernourished or go to bed hungry. That number has been rising over the last 4 years, really due to 3 C's: conflict, climate change, and COVID. We still have a significant number of children who are undernourished, either chronically or acutely. Chronic undernourishment is what's called stunting, or short for your height. And we have about 20% of the world's children under the age of 5 who are stunted, and 45 million children who are wasted or acutely malnourished due to seasonal hungers, microfamines, etc. And 2.2, this is now 2.2, is a little bit, I had the wrong slide in here. 2.2 billion adults are overweight and obese, and almost every country has an overweight obesity problem. And this map here on the right is showing you countries with double burdens of both undernutrition and overweight and obesity. So while we've seen 100 years of commitments towards ending hunger and malnutrition, what you can see is that malnutrition is still a massive and universal issue around the world, and largely not improving. What has improved is the devastations of famine. So in the chapter, we start to walk through these different points, and we have these 5 historic points in time. The first was in the 19th and 20th centuries. Much of the world was suffering from these significant famines, particularly in South Asia, like in India and what is now Bangladesh, and just hundreds of millions of people dying from famines. And this really called on governments and policymakers to try to end the scourge of famines, which they did through multiple ways. One was the famous Green Revolution that happened mainly in Asia and Latin America. But you can see now this tale here of many fewer people are dying from famine globally as compared to 50, 60, 70, up to 100 years ago. So this has largely been successful. There's less famine. Now, this is all to say, let's couch this with climate change, which could potentially, we could see a reversal of this if action's not taken on climate, but I'll come back to that. The second area of the book that we go into was this post-Second World War period, what we called the increasing the pile of food. There was this thought that the Malthusian theory that we would not be able to grow enough food for the rising population, the rapidly rising population. And through agriculture technologies like the Green Revolution, better hybrid seeds, better roads, better markets, better extension services in agriculture, we disproved that. We were able to keep growing a lot of calories in the agriculture supply, and we kept up with population pressure. And this was a remarkable success. Now, there are many trade-offs to this model: environmental trade-offs, nutrition trade-offs, gender trade-offs. But just from looking at a sheer per capita calories supplied, this was quite successful post-World War II. Then we moved on into the 80s, and there was a look at, well, just supplying, ensuring that there's a lot of food available, calories available in the system, may not be enough to really address the root causes of hunger. And so there was a real shifting of moving away from, let's just increase the supply of food, to trying to understand why people, certain populations, certain marginalized populations or disadvantaged populations cannot access food. Is it because of where they live? Is it because of the color of their skin, their capabilities? And Amartya Sen, many of you know, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, led a movement around the capabilities approach, the opportunities that people have to achieve the best person that they can be, and what are the social constraints in doing that. And so there was quite a shift and a focus on equitable growth and social protection programs to ensure that the most vulnerable populations are protected and can access food. And so there was a shift from this supply to available, or to accessing food. From there, in the 90s and in the 2010s, we really saw the emergence of the multiple dimensions of malnutrition. This idea that it's not just about hunger and poverty. Malnutrition is complex. It's not just about food. It's about gender empowerment. It's about health status. It's about the environment that we live in, the built environment, the natural environments. And that really, to address malnutrition, it takes a multi-sectoral approach involving many sectors: health, agriculture, education, urban and rural development. And we need to engage multiple stakeholders and multiple sectors if we really want to address the multiple dimensions of malnutrition. And during that time, we saw quite a decline in stunting. From 2000 to 2020, stunting had been coming down, but while we were focusing on the undernutrition side, overweight and obesity and non-communicable diseases were rising due to globalization, demographic changes, urbanization. So we saw this change over time. And this map here on the right shows you India, which was historically known to have the highest burdens of malnutrition. They've made significant progress on stunting, which is shown in the red. You can see in 2000, 2010, and then 2017, the declines and high levels of stunting. This was a typical picture in Bangladesh, Nepal, Ethiopia. Many countries were decreasing the rates of undernutrition among children. Now, again, some of that is being eroded away due to certain issues that I'll come back to. And in those first 4 stages, there were many summits about ending hunger. In 1963, the World Food Congress, 74, the World Food Summit, 1992, the International Conference on Nutrition, 96, the World Food Summit, which came up with the definition of what is food security, which is still used today, and others, leading to the 2014 Second International Conference on Nutrition. So many declarations were made, plans of action, trying to hold governments to account during these 4 or 5 decades of declarations, largely spearheaded by the United Nations. Well, where are we now? Well, we're in a more complex time in society. Now the focus is really on food systems, taking a systems approach. We can't work in isolated disciplines. We can't just work on food availability or food access. We need to think of the entire complex systems of food and how they relate to economic systems, health systems. And there's been many calls to transform food systems for reasons that I won't go into too much, but the big ones are that food systems are vulnerable to climate change, but also instigators of climate change. Food systems haven't delivered on healthy diets and better nutrition and health. Food systems haven't provided equitable livelihoods. So there's a lot of reasons for taking on this systems approach, but it adds a layer of complexity of how policymakers are supposed to tackle malnutrition in this systems type of thinking or systems lens. And now, because of this systems approach and thinking about malnutrition in all its forms, we have multiple ambitious goals. Not only do we have the SDGs, SDG 2, SDG 3 on health, but we have the World Health Assembly global targets to end undernutrition, to no increase in childhood overweight, to improve micronutrients status, and as well as decreasing diet-related non-communicable diseases. So it's not just the SDGs, but it's also the World Health Assembly targets that are being called for. But, one has to argue with so many lofty goals like the SDG 2s. Are they realistic? Can we get to zero hunger? When you look across the SDGs, there's many trade-offs. Economic growth will not always be beneficial for zero hunger. You can start to look across each of the goals and weigh the synergies and trade-offs if one goal is addressed at the expense of another, or if we try to tackle all of them at the same time. It's not so easy for governments. So how do we manage trade-offs? And how should governments decide on what their priorities should be across these SDGs? Well, when we look at SDG 2, we will not meet them for the goals for malnutrition. We are way off target. And we're even more off target now because of the Ukraine-Russia crisis and the pandemic, particularly overweight for children. We're nowhere near meeting it. We're actually going to just increase the burden, not even flatten or decrease. So the SDGs, while lofty and inspirational, this begs the question of realism, and how realistic are they? And is that de-incentivizing for governments when they see these kind of trends? I'll skip that. Some of the new challenges that we face now in the last 2 years are going to make this even more challenging when we think about the evolution and history of hunger and where we're at. We're seeing a rise in hunger. You know, here we are 100 years trying to end hunger, and we're seeing a rise. So we've seen this decline over the last couple of decades, and now a rise. And again, that's largely due to climate change, natural disasters. COVID has not helped, and now conflict. There's of course micro conflicts, but the Russia-Ukraine war is particularly alarming because of the wheat and fertilizer and feed that these two countries provide for a very globalized food system and a very globalized world. So there's a lot of modeling going on right now, but there's predictions that this is going to have devastating impacts on malnutrition and hunger. And another nuance we see now is that we're going back to the access issue. While we have a lot of food in the supply chains, there's still many people who cannot afford a healthy diet. This is a healthy diet, one that protects human health, meets nutrient needs. 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. That's incredible. That's a basic diet. And if you see the dark brown here, that shows you that mainly sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, between 75 and 100% of the population cannot afford a healthy diet. Talk about inequities. And, you know, with all of these, the 3 C's and, you know, these inequities of Elon Musk having $245 billion, and what has he invested in? Twitter. You know, we're seeing more inequities deepen and plague progress with this just vast wealth of just a handful of a few, with many people being left behind. The other big challenge is climate change. You know, it is barreling down on us. There's very little action, not enough. It's not swift enough. And if we talk about food systems, it's going to be very hard to turn around a potential crisis if we don't take action on climate. So this is a situation that will be for the history books to see if our world can come together and address climate before it's too late. And we have many political moments advocating for change, ending hunger and malnutrition. Still, beyond the SDGs, we've got the COP meetings that are bringing food in. We've got the UN Food System Summit. We got decades of action on nutrition and family farming. And there's a big effort, but how do we make these moments not just moments? How do we sustain these moments and create real political movement and action? Particularly in the face of these mega trends, these mega risks, things like geopolitical shifts, nationalism, migration, displacement, cyber issues. So we're really at an interesting time in the world that will play into what our future will look like if we want to truly address malnutrition and end hunger. So just my last two slides, what have we learned historically? Well, each of those 5 time periods have common ingredients. They share a commitment of collective action by states, civil society, and private sector to a defined target. The commitments go beyond just local efforts and social networks. But they operate mainly in communities. They don't really go beyond that. Another thing we noted is that the metrics, the goalposts have changed. We keep modifying the metrics, sharpening them, making them more specific, more measurable, and sorry, I've got COVID brain, more tangible. But those evolving metrics make it more difficult to claim success. So in summary, societies have to various degrees committed to trying to end hunger. A lot of that has been motivated by economic issues, political issues, humanitarian concerns as moral compass to try to address hunger. Since the 19th century, it's had international dimensions, starting with ending famines, but ending with international governance led by the League of Nations and the United Nations. Yet as we come into the SDG era, with a shameful legacy of high numbers of malnutrition, we're really at a crossroads of how we are going to truly address malnutrition and hunger. It's going to take sustained and committed leadership. It's going to take financial incentives and financial commitments. And all of this will have to be done in the context of a changing climate and climate disruption. But we really are at an interesting moment in time, and it will be interesting to see what lays ahead for the next 5 years. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry if that was depressing, Dan and Martin. It's not exactly a happy story at the moment.
Okay, well, I'll just now say a few minutes about, or a few things about SDG 17. I'm not sure I can lift our moods, but I'll shift our attention a little bit to, again, what I would call the operative clause, or the operative clause, our operative SDG. And one of the things I find interesting about SDG 17 is that it kicks off by urging the global community to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. And I highlight that second phrase because we've had a long history, of course, of international cooperation, which we can define in many, many different ways. So one of the things that I tried to do in the chapter is to flesh out what the Stockholm Resilience Center has proposed, as a way to think about the SDGs in terms of thinking about them like a wedding cake. So they're interconnected, but not necessarily evenly. So as Jeff talked about, of course, all of the SDGs fit together. They speak to each other, and perhaps progress on one will lead to regression in others and so forth. So whether it's in terms of international cooperation vis-a-vis the biosphere, society, or the economy, we've got a long history that we can look to either for models to follow, models to reject, or perhaps cooperative issues for which global actors are still looking for answers. So the way I organized the chapter was, as Martin did in a similar way, to think about timelines, to think about how we can periodize histories of international cooperation, which don't necessarily work in a linear or progressive fashion, that we have seen in the past moments of greater and lesser international cooperation. But what we do have is a long and deep history of international cooperation that the SDGs are at least sitting on top of. So whether that's 19th century international bureau, like over here you can see, and they're all men, the founders of the international, then the International Telegraph Union in 1865, which exists still today, and is the longest continuous, at least current international organization. Just mentioned the League, of course, which in the interwar period, here you can see the Palais des Nations, its headquarters, which is now the headquarters of the UN, or at least some of the UN's activities in Geneva. And the League is interesting for many reasons, but it was really an experiment in supranational governance. And again, Jess mentioned the League briefly in terms of what we now talk about as food security. Lots of initiatives that were born in the League, including in its later years in this building, continue with us today in lots of different ways. We're all familiar with the 1940s, the creation of the UN, the Big Bang, and all of that. Again, whether it's San Francisco and Dumbarton Oaks, whether it's the creation even before the UN proper, if you will, with the Food and Agriculture Organization in 1943, UNRWA, so the two UN organizations that predate the UN, if you will. We, of course, see lots of the infrastructure of our current multilateral system coming out of the Second World War. But what I find particularly interesting about that history is that it is in the mid-20th century that we begin to see the intensified density of global governance. So it's not as if 1945 is year zero in that history, but we do see an explosion of global governance activity. And we can see some of the consequences of that in the 1950s and the 1960s. Again, Jess talked about this in terms of hunger, in what I would refer to as a metrics revolution, that we see lots and lots of governance innovations in those decades that actors consciously brought to bear tools of measurement. So measurement itself as a mode of cooperation. The 1970s, in many ways, a global moment. So here, of course, is the famous Earthrise Moment. UN Secretary General U Thant spoke of spaceship Earth. A lot of those sort of metaphors were important in the 1970s, and we can see them reflected in histories of both sustainable development and international cooperation. So whether that's Stockholm in 1972, but also really in the 1970s, the birth of the mega conference. So Jessica had a number of mega conferences on a previous slide there, and you'll note that they begin in the 1960s and the 1970s especially. And then we can move forward to the 1990s, of course, the UN Our Common Neighborhood Report in 1995, and towards the MDGs, where in an age of at least conscious globalization, if you do a Google Ngram search on globalization, it skyrockets beginning in the 1990s. And I think that's important historically because more and more actors around the world see international cooperation to be a common global goal. So I won't give lots of examples of governance tools, sites, and modalities, but alongside a timeline of international cooperative initiatives, we can also look to a sort of historical timeline or timelines of ways of or modes of cooperation. So again, as Jess said, whether that's strategic partnerships between public and private actors, benchmarks, blueprints, targets. You can see on the slide here the Pakistani economist Mahmoud al-Haq, who's amongst many other people, helped to create the Human Development Index in 1990. Capacity building is a key international cooperative goal. So the UN spends tons of time, still today of course, but especially in the 1950s and 1960s, getting off the ground all kinds of capacity building initiatives to send experts and professionals, often from the global north to the global south, with the goal of building capacity. We can see international organizations and networks themselves consciously seeing themselves, especially by the 1970s, as problem-solving technologies, literally as tools to address global problems. And then again, we see from the 70s forward, global governance at scale. So whether it's mega conferences or increasingly globally dense cooperative networks, we can really, I would suggest, start to see global governance being global, so the global part added on in the 1970s. And then just a few examples before we can turn it over to some questions in terms of, again, some perhaps important benchmarks or examples of this periodization. So, and again, Jess talked about modeling and so forth. The late 1960s and 1970s was really the age of modeling. So, of course, famously, the Club of Rome's The Limits of Growth, or the Limits to Growth. We can see normative forms of international cooperation as well. So here's the first UNICEF greeting card, which was drawn by a Czech child in 1949. Again, trying to share ideas or underpin ideas of international cooperation on normative terms, essentially of cosmopolitanism. And then finally, I would point to histories of international cooperation that privilege some actors and disadvantage others. So it's just one of many examples we could point to. Here we see two images from the UN conference of International Women's Year in Mexico City in 1975. So on the left, you can see Patricia Hutar, who was the US delegate appointed by Gerald Ford in the middle. And then on the right, a photo I find more interesting, you can see another American activist. So there was an NGO tribune outside of the conference hall, which again is a pattern that has sort of developed or originated in the 1970s, and we can see it at pretty much any mega conference now. And what you can see is an American activist literally lecturing and pointing at an activist from the Global South, giving us an indication of some of the tensions in terms of feminist goals at the conference itself, as well as broader sort of social and gender divisions, globally speaking, because the caption of this image gives us the name, Ms. Ceballos, of the US activist, but not the name of the woman that she's speaking to. So I think that is just sort of again, one example, but that speaks to some broader sort of issues in terms of international cooperation. So those are just some of the highlights of the chapter that I did. I'll end my slide there, and we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions. I can just moderate that. If people have questions, you can just put up your hand and I'll direct them to the guests that you have a question for. Maybe while people think, I wonder if either or both of you could talk a little bit about, again, that point, Jess, that you brought up towards the end of your presentation, which I found quite interesting in terms of kind of interconnections between the issue areas affect or addressed in the particular SDGs, and whether historically speaking, we see, what sort of trade-offs maybe actors in the past have been forced to make or have made vis-a-vis those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think the trade-offs with the SDGs are kind of yet to be seen. Well, maybe we're starting to see them because we're now, 7 years into them, but, and I'm sure we can look to the MDGs for that. But, in my experience working in mainly low-income countries with maybe resource constraints, like for example, in Timor-Leste or in Nepal, 17 goals were just too much of an investment to take on, or some not as relevant. So what you saw as the MDGs or the SDGs were released was that countries were kind of picking and choosing specific SDGs to prioritize based on what they thought was most important, or where they think they had the most resources to invest in them. So it's interesting in that the SDGs were meant to be this roadmap, this holistic roadmap where you should be addressing all of them if you want to get on a path towards sustainable development. But instead you saw many countries just saying, okay, we're just going to focus on SDG 2, 3, and 8, because those are the ones that we care about, and the others we're just not going to worry about. So that's kind of a trade-off there, is just around I mean, and rightfully so, countries just didn't have the means, the capacity, human resource, financially to be able to take on such a broad set of goals, particularly if they felt it wasn't relevant for their national development strategies.
Maybe I can just quickly add to that, and then I see we've had some questions come in. I think it's very easy to focus on the, let's say, negative connections or interlinkages, where there are many examples where progress on one SDG will very likely lead to losses or deficits on another one. But I think there are also some policy issues where progress would be made across several SDGs. I think, for example, in terms of stimulants, tobacco, sugar, caffeine, maybe Jess, you can talk more about this as well, where tobacco occupies prime farmland, causes more deforestation because it often needs to be smoked using or roasted using wood that is logged. It is more polluting than a lot of edible crops, and it obviously has a tremendous impact on human health. And so while there are many tricky areas where progress on one SDG will be detrimental to another one, there's also clear policy areas where if we can get these issues nailed down, we will progress on multiple SDGs at the same time.
We've got a question first from Colleen Loomis, it's one of our faculty members here, and she asks, given the history between the MDGs and SDGs, and that we're 8 years away from 2030, I'm curious to hear authors' knowledge of future agendas or your thoughts on what is needed.
I mean, I can just start, and it'd be good to hear from you, Martin and Dan. Yeah, it's interesting, Colleen, because at least in my world, in the hunger and nutrition world, we had MDG 1, which was ending undernutrition. And largely, when you look across countries during that time period of the MDGs, most countries did not succeed in doing that. And then we just, that target was put into the SDGs, and then they broadened it to other forms of malnutrition. And are we going to be in the same situation in 2030 in which we're at a state where, okay, well, countries didn't achieve that, so let's go on to the next set of global goals? So I'm often wondering, are these global goals effective in real change? And for future agendas and global goal setting, what do we need to do to hold governments and all of their partners, whether it's private sector or civil society, to account, to hold them to account, to try to achieve those goals? Because if they're voluntary and they're not binding, or there's just a lack of incentive to really try to move towards those, or for even governments that are wealthy that could assist those that don't have the resources. You know, how do you hold them account to ensure that they provide assistance? So to me, there's a bit of, does global goal setting work, and how do we give it more teeth to hold those to account? If they are going to commit to these, they need to actually do something. They need to take action. I'm curious to know what Dan and Martin think. So, I mean, for me, the future agendas need to look differently. They need to be more binding or something. But that's in just my naive view of the global goals.
No, I guess I would just very quickly, and Martin, I'll let you in, just very quickly, I mean, and thinking back to past efforts, I mean, one of the things I'm struck by in the SDGs is the sort of mix of very specific targets, you know, goals and numbers and so forth. And Jess, you had some slides up there, you know, about that vis-a-vis hunger, and then the kind of normative and aspirational side. And I mean, thinking back I mentioned briefly the club enrollment and discussions of complexity. And there's sort of maybe it's a dark or an unfortunate irony, it seems to me sometimes, but of course, so many of these issues are tremendously complex, but that can sometimes lead to perhaps overly complex attempts to address them, which, at least if we look back to some past examples, in the past, of course, doesn't always predict the present, but has sometimes just created stasis. Either the normative drive collapses because people get exhausted and think nothing can be done, or the solutions are too complex to be sort of acted upon. Martin, and then we have a couple more questions.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. It's a very interesting and relevant question, and it's the second time I've been asked it in the course of a week, so I think I need to read up on this a bit. I've also only heard kind of chatter, nothing concrete on what will come next. And similar to what Jess described, I think in great detail, this idea of giving it whatever comes next more teeth, the voluntary nature of the SDGs may not be effective enough. The other issue I've also heard some chatter on is the idea of setting clearer priorities. The SDGs are very comprehensive, but that can, of course, also be a problem, as we're seeing.
That feeds maybe into the next question we have from Hani Al-Masri. On a more optimistic note, are there any particular lessons from history, from either of your work on this project, that you think can be drawn on to reasonably meet some of these goals? Certainly, there's lots of room for sort of a more negative view, obviously, because of the complexity again of some of these problems. But do we see historical legacies that give us some cause for optimism?
Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, that's also a tough one. I think it's important not to be too pessimistic, and I think there are some positive elements and stories in the book and elsewhere. What I would say just from my work is, I think very often in human history, we see that society is stuck in certain cultural patterns in behaving certain ways, and the resistance to change is quite strong, quite ingrained in structures and in culture. But there are also instances in which we have managed to change our paradigms and perspectives very quickly, often at the instigation of mass movements, not always governments. And those do give us some hope. I'm thinking, for example, of Germany post World War II, very effective democratization, of course, that coming on the back of an utter collapse and defeat, which hopefully we will not face with the climate and the other challenges we are currently staring into the face of.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the hunger and malnutrition side, we've got a lot of successes historically about, we did really eliminate massive famines. I mean, that was huge. And that was done through political will, through informing policymakers about the importance of reducing hunger if they want to be reelected, even, basic things like that. Science has been incredibly important in driving forward the political agendas. I mean, we've seen that with climate change. Talk about climate scientists staying the course, same message pretty much for 50 years now. I think policymakers are now listening, and it's scaring the hell out of them. Took them 50 years to listen, but they stayed doing it, same messages. And then innovation and technology can be really important with positive ratchets. And we've seen that over time in the malnutrition field, of these certain innovations that have really completely shifted a certain field, like in treating acute malnutrition, something called Plumpy Nut, or ready-to-use therapeutic food, has saved many children's lives, for example. Fortification, biofortification of foods. These are all these kind of technologies and innovations that, in the face of much adversity, have really had these positive ratchets and have improved public health and human lives, with many stories like that. It's just now this kind of, we're in this perfect storm of, that we're going to need new innovations and new technologies and new political will to kind of come together around what's now a more complex society and complex challenges that we're living in. But there are lots of successes to be drawn on. You could ask, why did Ethiopia, how did they reduce stunting? They cut stunting in half. They cut child mortality in half. Rwanda, when the genocide happened, their child mortality was off the charts, and now they're one of the lowest in the world. How did they do it? It's several reasons why: community empowerment, strong political leadership, science, innovation. It has to all kind of come together.
We have time for one more question here I can fit in. So Tracy Wagner, Rizvi asks if either of you can speak to the development of the paradigms, norms, and framings and so forth that shape the SDGs. Again, one of the sort of goals of the book was to show that, of course, the SDGs, were not created out of whole cloth, that there's histories both on the issue side, but also on the policy and the normative framework side. So I wonder, in your work, again, for the book, what kind of norms and paradigms and so forth have been driving, what appears in the goals?
I was going to say, I think this speaks directly to your chapter, Dan. Maybe you want to take that one and expand on it.
Well, certainly, in terms of SDG 17 as sort of the operational SDG, in some ways it's both the operative clause, but it's also kind of almost parasitic or subordinate to the other 16 issue specific SDGs, because all of them, of course, have dense and interconnected histories of international cooperation, some more so than others. And I think we do have some kind of international cooperative initiatives that have proved lasting. I sometimes use the kind of metaphor of sort of a wrench, right? That you turn it one way, and you can't go back the other way, which is not always necessarily good. But many of those sort of functionally oriented international bureaux from the late 19th and early 20th century, we still have with us today. And they have often been the site of sort of cooperation across all kinds of political and other barriers, just most notably the Americans and the Soviets, cooperated in many of these bodies all through the Cold War, even when politically the Cold War was at its most acute. The International Geophysical Year in the late 1950s, was dovetailing with the run-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you have this sort of almost bizarre mix there. And for all of the discussion of post-1945 multilateral international order and on and on and on, which that thesis or historical argument may or may not hold a lot of weight, depending on how we look at it. It does seem to have normative sticking power that many actors around the world, within or outside halls of power, seem tentative about giving that up, if for no other reason than there's not a clear, better option. So whether we look to Moscow or Brazil or Hungary or wherever, even populist leaders are not necessarily framing something new as an international order. They're critiquing, pushing back, exiting from a prevailing order. So thinking about international orders too, I think is important. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Both those of you who are still with us, and in absentia, those who have moved off to their next Zoom or Teams commitment. So thank you, Jess and Martin. It's good to see you, and to again launch this book out to more potential readers. Again, I quite enjoyed this project, and again, especially the editing sometimes, to be frank, is work. But I found it particularly interesting this time around, again, reading the work of scholars from other disciplines and drawing on them and thinking about how, I can take, the knowledge of experts and specialists working on all of these other areas and in different disciplines and try to think about that historically. I certainly I think of myself in this way, but historians are kind of professional amateurs or professional kind of magpies or gadflies, moving from area to area and thinking about the past, and we're reliant on experts both in the here and now and those experts that we study in the past. So this book was actually a way to really do that. And like I mentioned at the top, the programs we offer here, like at many institutions, including your own around the world, are interdisciplinary. So to actually really do that was an enjoyable process.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.